At noon, the church bell rang. 3 minutes later, the factory whistle answered. Across town, the railway clock insisted it was still 11:56. No one argued out loud, but trains hesitated at platforms. Shopkeepers adjusted receipts. A telegraph operator scratched out a timestamp and wrote it again. Noon had fractured into versions of itself, and the city continued as if that were normal. For most of human history, it was. Time belonged to the sun. Each town kept its own. When the sun reached its highest point, that was noon. A few miles east, noon arrived earlier. A few miles west, it came later. The difference was small, 4 minutes for every degree of longitude. But across a country, it accumulated into hours. In the early 19th century, this caused little trouble. Travel was slow. Messages moved at the speed of horses and ships. Local time fit local life. Then speed arrived. Railroads began stitching regions together with iron. In the United States, thousands of miles of track were laid in a matter of decades. Lines radiated from cities like Chicago and New York City, crossing states that had never needed to agree on the hour before. A train leaving one town at 10 a.m. could arrive in another at 9:52 a.m., according to the station clock. Schedules became negotiations with geography. At first, railway companies did what communities had always done. They set their clocks by the local sun. But as networks expanded, the math grew unstable. A single railway line might pass through dozens of local times in a single day. Conductors carried conversion tables. Station masters recalculated arrivals. Newspapers printed timetables filled with disclaimers. The problem was not philosophical, it was operational. A railroad is a choreography of motion. Trains share tracks. They pass each other at designated sidings. A delay of minutes can cascade into collisions. When each station defines now differently, coordination becomes fragile. The first people to notice were not politicians. They were dispatchers. Telegraph lines ran alongside the rails. Messages could move faster than trains. For the first time, it was possible to compare clocks instantly across distance. And when operators did, they discovered what had always been true but never consequential. The country disagreed with itself. In some regions, the difference between neighboring towns could be 5, 7, even 10 minutes. On paper, that was trivial. In practice, it was the margin between a safe crossing and a head-on crash. Railway companies began adopting internal standards. A line might run on company time, set to the clock of its headquarters. Employees adjusted watches accordingly, but passengers lived in local time. Cities maintained civic clocks. Churches rang bells by the sun. The result was a layered reality. Official railway time and unofficial community time coexisting uneasily. By the 1870s, the United States had more than 300 local time standards. Every significant town kept its own noon. The anomaly was no longer quaint, it was expensive. Missed connections meant lost freight. Confusion meant idle crews. Printing multiple timetables for different regions meant higher administrative cost. Insurance claims rose after scheduling errors. Precision, once optional, had become a commodity. Into this environment stepped a Canadian engineer named Sanford Fleming. After missing a train due to a timetable misprint, he began advocating for a global system of standardized time. His proposal was simple in concept and radical in implication. Divide the world into time zones, each 1 hour apart, anchored to a prime meridian. It required agreement not just within a nation, but across them. In 1884, delegates gathered in Washington, D.C. for the International Meridian Conference. Representatives from 25 nations debated where to place the zero line of longitude and how to structure global time. The outcome established the meridian at Greenwich as the international reference. It did not mandate time zones, but it created the framework for them. Yet in the United States, the decisive move did not come from Congress. It came from the railroads. On November 18, 1883, railway companies implemented what became known as the Day of Two Noons. At precisely designated moments, station clocks were reset to align with 4 standardized time zones across the country: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. There was no federal law requiring it. At midday in cities from Boston to San Francisco, clocks paused. Some jumped forward, others fell back. In certain places, noon occurred twice. Newspapers described crowds gathering to watch public clocks change. Some treated it as spectacle, others as inconvenience. A few objected on principle, arguing that local solar time was more natural. But trains departed on schedule. Within days, most major cities informally aligned their civic clocks with railway time. Businesses followed. Banks adjusted hours. Courts revised schedules. Standard time, born of corporate coordination, became public reality. There was no dramatic enforcement, no sweeping proclamation, just synchronization. In a small watch repair shop in Cleveland, a craftsman named Elias Turner spent the morning of November 18th recalibrating pocket watches for regular customers, conductors, salesmen, a school teacher who relied on the 3:10 afternoon train. Each adjustment was only a few minutes, but Elias understood that those minutes now belonged to something larger than the sun outside his window. The structural pivot was subtle but profound. Time once observed was now administered. Before standardization, communities experienced time as a local phenomenon. Afterward, they experienced it as a network condition. Noon in one place was no longer independent of noon elsewhere. It was part of a coordinated grid. And here is the unexpected detail. When the railroads imposed standard time in 1883, the federal government did nothing to formalize it for decades. It was not until the Standard Time Act of 1918 that Congress legally adopted time zones. For 35 years, the nation ran on a privately organized temporal system. The infrastructure of time preceded its legislation. This inversion mattered. It demonstrated that coordination could originate in operational necessity rather than political decree. The authority of the clock shifted quietly from church towers to corporate headquarters, from astronomy to logistics. The economic implications sharpened quickly. Railway freight contracts began specifying delivery times tied to standardized zones. Insurance policies referenced departures and arrivals according to unified clocks. Factories synchronized shifts with train schedules to optimize supply chains. Minutes became units of calculation, billable and enforceable. Consider labor. In an era when industrial workdays stretched 10 or 12 hours, start and end times define wages. When clocks disagree, disputes follow. Standard time reduced ambiguity. Employers could measure lateness precisely. Workers could contest unpaid hours with reference to an agreed system. Time was monetized through consistency. Telegraph companies benefited as well. Accurate timestamps increased the reliability of financial transactions. Stock exchanges relied on synchronized clocks to record trades. Banks cleared payments with greater confidence when 3 p.m. meant the same thing across cities. Coordination reduced friction increased velocity, increased profit, yet resistance lingered in pockets. Some towns refused to abandon local solar time. In a few places, two clocks hung side by side, one for railway time, one for local preference. Gradually, the duplication felt impractical. Commerce favored uniformity. By the early 20th century, standard time was normalized. Children learned time zones in school. Wall maps depicted longitudinal divisions. The memory of temporal pluralism faded, but the system continued evolving. In 1918, alongside formalizing time zones, the United States introduced daylight saving time as a wartime measure to conserve energy. Clocks would shift seasonally, extending evening daylight for industrial productivity. Though controversial and repeatedly revised, the practice reinforced a central idea. Time could be adjusted administratively to serve economic goals. The clock was no longer a passive instrument, it was a policy tool. Decades later, global aviation demanded further precision. Coordinated universal time emerged as an international standard, maintained by atomic clocks rather than celestial observation. Satellites and digital networks rely on nanosecond accuracy. Financial markets execute trades in microseconds. The underlying logic remains consistent with 1883. Shared time enables shared action. Psychologically, the transition is complete. Few people experience time as local. We assume universality. When a meeting is scheduled for 2 p.m., we do not question whose 2 p.m. it is. The device in our pocket synchronizes automatically with distant servers. The adjustment happens invisibly. Normalization is powerful. What once required public clock resets and newspaper announcements now occurs silently through software updates. And yet the structure is still maintained by agreement. Time zones are human constructs layered onto planetary rotation. They reflect political boundaries, economic relationships, and historical compromises. Some regions bend the grid for convenience. Others align with trading partners rather than geography. The map of time is less natural than it appears. In the late 19th century, the shift to standard time resolved operational chaos. It reduced accidents, streamlined commerce, enabled national markets. It was a rational response to acceleration, but it also redefined daily life. Workdays became more tightly scheduled. Trains departed without waiting for stragglers whose watches ran slow. Schools rang bells in coordination with distant systems. The margin for temporal drift narrowed. When time is standardized, deviation becomes visible. A missed train is no longer a misunderstanding of the sun. It is a failure to align with the network. The adoption of standard time illustrates a broader pattern in modern history. Infrastructure reshapes perception. Once a system becomes widespread, it feels inevitable. Alternatives recede into obscurity. Few Americans today are aware that before 1883, noon in Detroit differed from noon in Pittsburgh by more than 20 minutes. Fewer still imagine a country where each town defines its own hour. The transformation did not arrive with spectacle, it arrived with timetables. In retrospect, it seems obvious that a nation connected by rail required unified time. But inevitability is often hindsight applied to contingency. The railroads could have fragmented, regions could have resisted longer. The federal government could have intervened earlier. Instead, synchronization spread through practice. The bells still rang, the sun still rose, but the reference point had shifted. Today, when we cross time zones by airplane, our devices adjust before we land. When we schedule a video call across continents, software translates hours instantly. We inhabit a temporally integrated world constructed over generations. The first step was acknowledging that local noon was insufficient for a network society. Standard time did not change the planet's rotation. It changed coordination. It allowed distant strangers to act in concert without negotiation over the hour. It reduced ambiguity in contracts, transportation, and communication. And it made time measurable in ways that could be priced. Minutes became inventory. Delays became liabilities. Punctuality became a virtue reinforced by systems rather than solely by character. In the watchmaker's shop in Cleveland, Elias Turner finished his adjustments and stepped outside. The church bell rang again, aligned now with the railway clock down the street. The sound was familiar. The meaning was not. The town had not moved. The sun had not shifted. But noon no longer belonged to them alone. Time had become shared infrastructure, and once shared, it could never be entirely private again. The clock did not conquer distance, it standardized it. Was standardized time an inevitable result of industrialization, or could a decentralized system have endured longer?